Hello, welcome back. We are covering more of Wittgenstein today. Let's not waste any time. Let's go ahead and hop right in. I think this is going to be, I'm not really sure what this symbol means. In example 15, we introduced proper names into language from paragraph 8. Paragraph 8 was originally our pillar slab language, so we've introduced proper names into that language. Now suppose that the tool with the name N is broken. Not knowing this, A gives B the sign N. Has this sign meaning now or not? What is B to do when he is given it? We have not settled anything about this. One might ask, what will he do? Well, perhaps he will stand there at a loss, or show A the pieces. Here one might say, N has become meaningless, and this expression would mean that the sign N no longer has a use in our language game, unless we gave it a new one. N might also become meaningless because, for whatever reason, the tool was given another name, and the sign N could no longer used in the language game. But we could also imagine the convention whereby B has to shake his head in reply if A gives him the sign belonging to a tool that is broken. And this way the command N might be said to be given a place in the language game even when the tool no longer exists, and the sign N to have meaning even when its bearer ceases to exist. But has, for instance, a name which has never been used for a tool also got a meaning in that game? Let us assume that X is such a sign and that A gives the sign to B. Well, even such signs could be given a place in the language game, and B might have, say, to answer them too with a shake of his head. One could imagine this as a sort of joke between them. For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus. The meaning of a word is its use in the language, which is a pretty big deal. And the meaning of a name is sometimes explained by pointing to its bearer. We said that the sentence, Excalibur has a sharp blade, made sense even when Excalibur was broken in pieces. Now this is so because in this language game, a name is also used in the absence of its bearer. But we can imagine a language game with names, that is, with signs which we would certainly include among other names, in which they are used only in the presence of the bearer, and so could always be replaced by a demonstrative pronoun in the gesture of pointing. The demonstrative this can never be without a bearer. It might be said, so long as there is a this, the word this has a meaning too, whether this is simple or complex. But that does not make the word into a name. On the contrary, for a name is not used with, but only explained by means of the gesture of pointing. The demonstrative this can never be without a bearer. On the contrary, for a name is not used with, but only explained by means of the gesture of pointing. What lies behind the idea that names really signify simples? I wonder exactly what we mean by simples here, as opposed to just complexes. We're talking about... I'm not exactly sure. Socrates says in the Theaetetus, if I make no mistake, I have heard some people say this, there is no definition of the primary elements, so to speak, out of which we and everything else are composed. For everything that exists in its own right can only be named. No other determination is possible, neither that it is nor that it is not. But what exists in its own right has to be named without any other determination. In consequence, it is impossible to give an account of any primary element. For it, nothing is possible but the bare name. Its name is all it has. But just as what consists of these primary elements is itself complex, so the names of the elements become descriptive language by being compounded together. For the essence of speech is the composition of names. Interesting. Both Russell's individuals and my objects from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus were such primary elements. But what are the simple constituent parts of which reality is composed? What are the simple constituent parts of a chair? The bits of wood of which it is made, or the molecules, or the atoms? Simple means not composite. And here the point is, in what sense composite? It makes no sense at all to speak of the simple parts of the chair. Again, does my visual image of this tree, of this chair, consist of parts? And what are its simple component parts? Multicoloredness is one kind of complexity. Another is, for example, that of a broken outline composed of straight bits. And a curve can be said to be composed of an ascending and a descending segment. If I tell someone without any further explanation, what I see before me now is composite, he will have the right to ask, what do you mean by composite? For there are all sorts of things that can mean. The question, is what you see composite, makes good sense if it is already established what kind of complexity, that is, what particular use of the word, is in question. If it had been laid down that the visual image of a tree was to be called composite, if one saw not just a single trunk, but also branches, then the question, is the visual image of this tree simple or composite? And the question, what are its simple component parts, would have a clear sense, a clear use. And of course the answer to the second question is not the branches. That would be an answer to the grammatical question, what are here called simple component parts, but rather a description of the individual branches. But isn't a chessboard, for instance, obviously and absolutely composite? You are probably thinking of the composition out of 32 white and 32 black squares. But could we not also say, for instance, that it was composed of the colors black and white and the schema of squares? And if there are quite different ways of looking at it, do you still want to say that the chessboard is absolutely composite? Asking, is this object composite outside a particular language game, is like asking what a boy once did, who had to say whether the verbs in certain sentences were in the active or passive voice, and who racked his brains over the question whether the verb to sleep meant something active or passive. We use the word composite, and therefore the word simple, in an enormous number of different and differently related ways. Is the color of a square on a chessboard simple, or does it consist of pure white and pure yellow? And is white simple, or does it consist of the colors of the rainbow? Is this length of 2 centimeters simple, or does it consist of 2 parts, each 1 centimeter long? But why not of 1 bit 3 centimeter long, and of 1 bit 1 centimeter long, measured in the opposite direction? I wonder, is what he's getting at here just that the world appears to us to be infinitely divisible, down to, I mean, I guess the simple, would a quark be a simple? I'm not sure. I poorly understand physics well enough to comment on that. I wonder if what he's getting at is, what is this literally the smallest possible unit of qualia, maybe, of experience? Not sure. To the philosophical question, is the visual image of this tree composite, and what are its component parts? The correct answer is, that depends on what you mean by composite. And that is, of course, not an answer, but a rejection of the question. Let us apply the method of example 2 to the account in the Theaetetus. Let us consider a language game for which this account is really valid. The language serves to describe combinations of colored squares on a surface. The squares form a complex like a chessboard. There are red, green, white, and black squares. The words of the language are, correspondingly, R, G, W, B, and a sentence is a series of these words. They describe an arrangement of squares in the order, and there's a depiction of 9 squares here. And so, for example, the sentence RRBGGGRWW describes an arrangement of the sort, and there are, let's see, red, red, blue, green, 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 red, white, white squares. Here the sentence is a complex of names to which corresponds a complex of elements. The primary elements are the colored squares. But are these simple? I do not know what else you would have me call the simples. What would be more natural in this language game? But under other circumstances, I would call a monochrome square composite, consisting perhaps of 2 rectangles, or of the elements color and shape. But the concept of complexity might also be so extended to a smaller area that was said to be composed of a greater area and another one subtracted from it. But the concept of complexity might also be so extended that a smaller area was said to be composed of a greater area and another one subtracted from it. Interesting. Compare the composition of forces, the division of a line by a point outside of it. These expressions show that we are sometimes even inclined to conceive the smaller as a result of the composition of greater parts, and the greater as a result of the division of the smaller. But I do not know whether to say that the figure described by our sentence consists of 4 or 9 elements. Well, does the sentence consist of 4 letters or of 9? And what are its elements, the types of letter or its letters? Does it matter which we say, so long as we avoid misunderstandings in any particular case? But what does it mean to say that we cannot define, that is, describe these elements, but only name them? This might mean, for instance, that when in a limiting case, a complex consists of only one square, its description is simply the name of the colored square. Here we might say that this all easily leads to all kinds of philosophical superstition, that a sign R or B, etc., may be sometimes a word and sometimes a proposition. But whether it is a word or a proposition depends on the situation in which it is uttered or written. For instance, if A has to describe complexes of colored squares to B, and he uses the word R alone, we shall be able to say that the word is a description, a proposition. But if he's memoing the words and their meanings, or if he is teaching someone else the use of the words and uttering them in the course of ostensive teaching, we shall not say that they are propositions. In this situation, the word R, for instance, is not a description, it names an element. But it would be queer to make that a reason for saying that an element can only be named. For naming and describing do not stand on the same level. Naming is a preparation for description. Naming is so far not a move in the language game, any more than putting a piece in its place on the board is a move in chess. We may say, nothing has so far been done when a thing has been named. It has not even got a name except in the language game. This is what Frege meant too when he said that a word had meaning only as part of a sentence, which I understand. I think I understand what they're getting at there, that sort of outside of the context of the whole language game, what does a word meaning? The word depends on the language game to sort of derive its context and usage from, and it will have a bunch of different uses within that language game, of course. But what does it mean to say that we can attribute neither being nor non-being to elements? One might say, if everything that we call being and non-being consists in the existence and non-existence of connections between elements, it makes no sense to speak of elements being, non-being, just when everything that we call destruction lies in the separation of elements. It makes no sense to speak of the destruction of an element. Because if it can be destroyed, then it would be separated, and if it was separated, then it wasn't an element. Got it. Okay. One could, however, like to say, existence cannot be attributed to an element, for even if it did not exist, one could not even name it, and so could not say anything at all of it. But let us consider an analogous case. There is one thing of which one can say neither that it is 1 meter long, nor that it is not meter long, and that is the standard meter in Paris. Not 100% sure what this means. But this is, of course, not to ascribe any extraordinary property to it, but only to mark its peculiar role in the language game of measuring with a meter rule. Let us imagine samples of color being preserved in Paris, like the standard meter. We define sepia means the color of the standard sepia, which is there kept hermetically sealed. I think they used to do this. I don't think this is the case anymore, but they did this with the kilogram for a while, and I think it was in Paris, where literally they had an object called Le Grand Que that was like the definition of what a kilogram was. I think they've changed that now. But they used to do this kind of thing. That it will make no sense to say of this sample either that it is of this color or that it is not. Right, because if it's defined as what it is, then it has to be what it is. If red is the definition, if red is just whatever this color swatch is kept in a vault, then you couldn't even call that color red in that circumstance. It just, that's what is defining red. And of course, if that would also imply that if the color darkened over time, that red would darken over time as well, if that's sort of how we defined that. We can put it like this. This sample is an instrument of the language used in descriptions of color. In this language game, it is not something that is represented, but it is a means of representation. And just as this goes for an element in a language game, from paragraph 48, when we name it by or not paragraph, but I guess section 48, really, come to think of it. When we name it by uttering the word R, this gives this object a role in our language game. It is now a means of representation. And to say, if it did not exist, it would have no name, is as much to say and as little to say as, if this thing did not exist, we could not use it in our language game. What looks as if it had to exist is part of the language. It is a paradigm in our language game, something with which comparison is made. And this may be an important observation, but it is nonetheless an observation concerning our language game, our method of representation. In describing language game from part 48, I said that the words R, B, etc. corresponded to the colors of the squares. But what does this correspondence consist in? In what sense can one say that certain colors of the squares correspond to these signs? For the account in part 48, merely set up a connection between those signs and certain words of our language, the names of colors. Well, it was presupposed that the use of the signs in the language game would be taught in a different way, in particular by pointing to paradigms. Very well, but what does it mean to say that in the technique of using the language, certain elements correspond to the signs? Is it always that a person who's describing the complexes of colored squares always says R when there's a red square, B when there's a black one, and so on? But what if he gets wrong in the description and mistakenly says R when he sees a black square? What is the criterion by which this is a mistake? Or does R standing for a red square consist in this, that when the people whose language it is to use R, a red square always comes before their minds? In order to see more clearly, here as in countless similar cases, we must focus on the details of what goes on. One must look at them from close to. If I'm inclined to suppose that a mouse has come into being by spontaneous generation out of gray rags and dust, I shall do well to examine those rags very closely to see how a mouse may have hidden in them, how it may have gotten there, and so on. But if I am convinced that a mouse cannot come into being from these things, then this investigation will perhaps be superfluous. But first we must learn to understand what it is that opposes such an examination of details in philosophy. Our language game from part 48 has various possibilities. There's a variety of cases in which we could say that a sign in the game was the name of a square of such and such a color. We should say so, for instance, we knew that people who used the language were taught the use of the signs in such and such way. Or if it were set down in writing, say in the form of a table, that this element corresponded to this sign, and if the table were used in teaching the language and were appealed to in certain disputed cases. We can also imagine such a table being a tool in the use of the language. Describing a complex is then done like this. The person who describes the complex has a table with him and looks up each element of the complex in it and passes from this to the sign, and the one who is given the description may also use a table to translate it into a picture of colored squares. This table might be said to take over here the role of memory and association in other cases. We do not usually carry out the order, "Bring me a red flower," by looking up the color red in a table of colors, and then bringing up the flower of the color that we find in the table. But when it is a question of choosing or mixing a particular shade of red, we do sometimes make use of a sample or table. If we call such a table the expression of a rule of the language game, it can be said that what we call a rule of the language game may have very different roles in the game. Let us recall the kinds of case where we say that a game is played according to a definite rule. The rule may aid in the teaching of a game. The learner is told and given practice in applying it, or it is an instrument of the game itself. A rule is implied neither in the teaching nor in the game itself, nor is it set down in a list of rules. One learns the game by watching how others play. But we say that it is played according to such and such rules because an observer can read these rules off in the practice of the game, like a natural law concerning the play. But how does the observer distinguish in this case between the player's mistakes and correct play? There are characteristic signs of it in the player's behavior. Think of the behavior characterizing of correcting a slip of the tongue. It would be possible to recognize that someone was doing so even without knowing the language. What the names in language signify must be indestructible, for it must be possible to describe the state of affairs in which everything destructible is destroyed, and this description will contain words, and what corresponds to these cannot then be destroyed, for otherwise the words would have no meaning. I must not saw off the branch on which I am sitting. One might of course object at once that this description would have to accept itself from the destruction, but what corresponds to the separate words of the description, and so cannot be destroyed if it is true, is what gives the words their meaning, is that without which they would have no meaning. In a sense, however, this man is surely what corresponds to his name. But he is destructible, and his name does not lose its meaning when the bearer is destroyed. An example of something corresponding to the name, and without which it would have no meaning, is a paradigm that is used in connection with the name in the language game. Okay, folks, I'm going to call it there right now. We're making some good progress through this text. If you wouldn't mind giving the channel a subscribe and giving the video a like, I would certainly appreciate that. Thank you so very much for reading along with me today. You have a good one.